that Jesus did was he affirmed lawful governance. Let's look at Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Somebody go ahead and read this.
And Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were amazed at him.
Okay, so one of the things that we need to understand about this statement is that they were trying to trap him. We all know that. Everybody, every sermon ever preached on this topic, every class, every taught on this verse, they always say the same thing. Well, they were trying to trap him. They were trying to trap him. Well, one of the things that we need to understand is the historical context here. All right. Both the Sadducees and the Pharisees were actually essentially leaders of the law. Yeah, it was the law of Moses, but in those times, the law of Moses was both not only a spiritual thing, but it was also a physical thing. It was the political arm of the Jewish culture. The other thing that we also need to take into consideration is the fact that the Jews had been subjected by the Romans. Okay. And so when the Romans would come into a conquered territory, they would allow that territory, specifically the Jews. They had a special thing going on with the Jews, where they would allow the Jews to govern themselves as long as they paid tribute to Caesar, taxes. And those taxes that was spent were to go to help the Romans build roads, kind of similar to what it's supposed to be today. However, I've driven down a few roads in Des Moines that make me wonder whether or not that's what our taxes are going to. But it was these taxes were supposed to help Rome take care of these roads, and then Rome protected the Jews from all outside enemies. Okay, and so that's why these taxes were to go to Rome, just like any other government. So taxes was a political thing, but in this day, you had these people called zealots who did not like the fact that they had to pay taxes to Rome. And so they thought they could trap Jesus by making him take a side, and they wanted him to take a side. If he says, pay your taxes, well, he's going to ostracize half the Jews who hate Rome and don't think that they should pay taxes to anybody. And if he says, don't pay taxes, now their problem's taken care of. Jesus is going to find a Roman division breathing down his neck. So Jesus's comment was full of divine wisdom. And what he does is he essentially states, which was kind of against, I mean, he took a stand. And I think that we really kind of forget that he actually did take a side here. A lot of times when they tried to trap him, we look at how he answered, and we like to try to say, well, he got past this trap by acknowledging Jesus's or God's authority. Well, he did, but we forget that he actually took a side. He didn't side with the anti-Roman zealots who refused to pay. Instead, he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And if you remember the story, I believe he actually took a coin and he says, whose face is on this coin? Remember that? Well, that's Caesar's. Okay, well, then render to Caesar's what was Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So he is highlighting the fact that we need to give Caesar his due, but we also need to give God what his. So he's saying God takes preeminence. Okay, God doesn't care about the coins that have Caesar's image on them. He does care what we do with them, and so we need to render to those in authority over us what is due. Jesus wasn't endorsing tyranny. He wasn't endorsing political passivity. He didn't take a compromising stance here. He didn't take a passive stance here. He didn't try to duck this question. He didn't hem and haw, did he? He wasn't being a politician, but he was talking about politics. Being a politician meant he would have tried to find a statement that would have appeased both parties, but he didn't care about appeasing both parties, did he? In this day, in this time, he made an extreme political statement. You got to think about the fact that I believe less than 30 years, it was either 60 or 80, I can't remember the exact date, but less than 30 years later, the Jews would rebel against Rome for the final time. and a huge Roman army would descend upon Jerusalem and encircle it, and then finally destroy the temple. And a lot of it was because the Jews refused to pay taxes. And I've not read anywhere where this tax was undue, it was burdensome. This was tax that everybody had to pay if you're going to be a Roman citizen, if you were going to be under Roman rule. So the idea here, and let's go to Romans chapter 13. The idea here that Jesus is stating is that citizens must honor, and I want to use the term just governance. Okay, but they must never elevate human authority above God's authority. Let's read chapter 13, 1 through 7. Romans 13, 1 through 7.
There is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. He does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor.
Okay, so again, Christian citizens must honor just government. And the reason why I put that just in there as a caveat um, is that once a government starts to go down this route where they do not recognize the authority of God, then I think Christians, we need to start paying attention. We need to start paying attention long before that happens. But um, you're going to find that this government is going to cease to be just. If we go down and we look in verse 3 says, rulers are not a cause of fear, but for good behavior. Or sorry, for rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but evil. In other words, rulers, a just ruler, a good ruler is going to remove people who commit crimes from the equation, putting them in prison or killing them. So these are the type of rulers we are to submit ourselves to. Okay. Just recently, and I mean just recently, and this is, again, I believe the church needs to be calling people out like this. And a lot of people will say, well, churches shouldn't mention politicians' names. Absolutely, we should. If they're doing something stupid, we need to call them out. There's a reason why Paul told Timothy to be instant in season out and out of season, reprove and rebuke, right? We are called to do these things. And just recently, there was a representative in Congress by the name of Jasmine Crockett who went on a podcast, and she made the comment that people who commit crimes are not criminals. I'll let that sink in for a minute. And she wasn't even a blonde. Yes.
This week, the guy that killed the assassinator,
Yes.
he could get the death penalty.
Right.
The other side of his whole, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus want him to get the death penalty?
Well, because of the principles that we see here, where and it's not just rendering It's not just rendering tax to whom tax is due, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor is due, custom to whom. But there's a whole principle in the scriptures that talk about the fact that we will reap what we sow. Okay, and um, uh, everybody who committed crimes in the Old Testament under the law of Moses and even in the New Testament were subject to repercussions based on the fallout of the crime they committed. If you think about, correct, and if you think about uh, Cain who killed Abel, what happened to him? I mean, he had a lot of repercussions. I mean, he didn't die essentially. He wasn't killed for what he did, but he was on the run for almost the rest of his life. Um, so if a court of his peers passes judgment that says he is going to die for what he did, then he's going to die for what he did. And Jesus would be okay with that. Now, on the flip side of the coin, Jesus would advise the family of Charlie Kirk to forgive this person and not to harbor hatred, bitterness, or animosity in their hearts for this person. That principle is also there. So we can't get that confused. But getting back to this topic, this lady said that criminals, or that people who commit crime are not criminals. And this is a prevailing thing today, is that um, there are people out there today in politics that are trying to make excuses for people who make crime or who commit crime, like the killer of Kirk, like you mentioned, and try to say, well, we shouldn't put them to death, or we shouldn't, they shouldn't have to pay for their crimes. I find it ironic that, and this was mentioned last night, so this is not my statement, but I find it ironic that the same people who wanted to imprison us in our own homes during COVID will not put criminals in cuffs or in jail. They let them go free. Um, so um, I just find that fascinating. But again, this shows my whole point with all of this is this shows that right now we have, I think, reason to fear because our government is ceasing to become just. And hopefully this whole thing with Charlie Kirk will flip that. But right now we have people in government over us who's trying to say that just because you commit a crime doesn't mean you're a criminal. You can go and rob somebody, but that doesn't make you a criminal. Yes.
They're saying that they're not gonna put them in jail because they're of the same mindset. We need to be able to have mindset.
Right.
And they're of the same mindset. So I don't want to put in jail right. So why would I put somebody else in jail?
Right. So again, the whole point here is we are to be subject to just civil authority. And I do believe, based off of Romans 13 and other passages, there is a time when a civil authority ceases to be just. And because our mindset needs to be focused on biblical authority, um, there is a time when we rebel against civil authority. The civil authority says we can't worship anymore. Well, we're going to worship civil authority, like they did back after Jesus died. The Romans started changing things up. The Romans said, all right, we're going to let you live. We're not going to persecute you. All you need to do is say that Jesus did not rise from the dead. That's all. We're not even going to make you stop worshiping this man, Jesus. All you need to do is just recant one thing about your religion, one thing. You can preach baptism, you can do the Lord's Supper, you can do all these things. But one thing you have to recant, and that is that Jesus raised from the dead. And Christians refuse to do so and were put to death. And those are the cases. That is not a just government. And we are called to rebel against that because God needs to have preeminence. Jesus also condemned corruption. Let's look at Matthew chapter 23. And let's just read 23, and we're going to read a lot. So let's just go around the room, guys. Start with verse 1, and let's just go around the room, and everybody gets to read a little bit, all the way down to verse 36. So let everybody read just 2 verses. And we'll start over here with Pam.
And they tie up heavy burdens and lay them on the men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger.
Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide, their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. And respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers.
Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leader, for one is your leader, that is Christ.
The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself, humble himself to himself.
So woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation.
Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by the oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift of the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar swears both by the altar and by everything on it.
The one who takes an oath by the temple takes an oath by it and by him who dwells in it. And the one who takes an oath by heaven takes an oath by God's throne, by him who sits on it.
We are going to verse 36. I guess they don't want to read. We'll come back up to Pamela again.
Will be described as Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tie mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, who strain out a gnat but swallow a camel.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also.
Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to be people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous. And you say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets.
So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers.
Serpents, you brood about the vipers, how will you escape sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city.
That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation.
Okay, so a couple of things that I think we need to mention. Number one is at the very beginning, he talks about the scribes and Pharisees that have seated themselves upon the chair of Moses. And one of the things that we need to understand is that Moses' seat was expected, whoever sat in that seat was expected to faithfully convey the commandments and uphold the community's adherence to the law. And we also lose sight of the fact that this law of Moses was more than just a spiritual thing. The law of Moses told you how to live spiritually correct, yes. But the law of Moses also told one how to live as a person. It governed society as a whole, it governed them, not just spiritually. It wasn't just talking about sacrifice. Okay, it also talked about how the head of the household was to perform his duties. It talked about not just how priests were supposed to do their role in the temple, but how kings were to rule. I mean, everything that has anything to do about physical law was talked about in the law of Moses. This was definitely a political thing. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were a political entity. They weren't just a spiritual entity, they were a physical, political entity. King Herod wouldn't do anything unless he had the Pharisees and the Sadducees in his pocket. The other thing I think we need to notice here, there's several things in this. One of the things is he tells them, don't be called rabbi. I mean, I don't know what it is in the church with our need for titles. I mean, preachers will get upset and argue and debate over the word pastor. I don't care. Somebody wants to call themselves pastor, I don't care. I disagree with it. Okay, I do believe if we're going to get down and get technical, all right, if we're going to argue semantics, I believe that the word pastor is a translation from the New Testament that means elder. So unless you meet these specific qualifications that we see in the Bible, you can't be a pastor. But if somebody wants to be called a pastor, I'm going to take Paul's line there that, I'm not going to have an argument over it. But comes down to the fact that Jesus even told these rabbis, don't be called rabbis. That they're using it as a title. That was the idea, is these rabbis wanted to be called by a title. They wanted that. So preachers that want a title and they want to argue over whether or not they're called pastor, put it on their business cards, put it on the church website. Everywhere they go, they need to be introduced by reverend or by pastor or by doctor. And even those that are more conservative, they want to be called evangelist. Well, that's what I am. That's not my title. All right. So I find that very interesting. And so I think when he talks about uh, when he's telling people, hey, therefore in verse 3, all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds. So when you find people that insist on being called pastor or that want to put evangelist in front of their name, observe it, understand that, that's just one thing I think to chalk up and say, you know what, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention, and challenge kind of what this person says. Because if a title means this much to him, what else is he teaching that might not necessarily be true? Um,
Sure. Thank the guy, pastor, reverend, he signs checks, reverend or pastor.
yeah.
It's small town out and get away with that. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. When religious leaders colluded with Rome for power, Jesus called them hypocrites. He called them whitewashed tombs. He called them sons of hell. That's a pretty huge political statement. He's telling these groups of men who are definitely part of the political landscape in Jerusalem, in Israel, to try to say, and again, I can't reiterate this enough, to try to say that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were not a part of the political landscape is ignorance. It's ignorance, plain ignorance. So he's calling these politicians, because that's what they were, he's calling these politicians sons of hell, whitewashed tombs, and hypocrites. Again, was Jesus political? Absolutely. Absolutely. These were the men who kind of adjudicated how one lived. Another thing that I think he exposed here was we have a lot of modern church leaders today and churches as a whole who soften truth to appease regimes. And by that, I mean, we have churches out there that aren't preaching the truth because they don't want to irritate or upset the political people in power. Sometimes it might be harder to see in America where we have more freedom, but we have story after story of churches in Germany who would espouse Hitler, and they would say good things about Hitler because they're afraid of consequences. And we have good stories of churches that would decry what he did and say, hey, this is wrong. And we have examples of those people being killed or sent to Dachau at the best, at very best. They were sent to Dachau as political prisoners. At worst, they were killed there. And so he's calling out these church leaders who kind of also focus on or um, uh, they kind of focus on every jot and tittle of a thing. Um, so he talks about the weightier matters of the law, and he condemns these leaders over obsessing over minor tithing details while neglecting core values of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And ultimately, that's the overarching theme of this particular passage, is that we're called to sincere, faithful, humble living, and that religious authority and knowledge are hollow without an authentic compassion for others. All right. So I've been in the church long enough that I have literally, seriously, been condemned as a minister, by the way, preaching. When I preach and I put my bottle of water or my cup of coffee right here, I've had people come up to me and condemn me for that. How dare you put your cup of coffee on the altar? Oh my goodness. This thing right here this is modern. It might be, we might have been doing this for 100 years, but it's still modern in the grand scheme of things. They never had this in the early days. This is a human thing right here. And we have people that want to condemn something so trivial as putting papers on there. And I'm serious. I had my Bible on here, and I was approached and said I shouldn't even put my Bible on there. Want to focus on the trivial matters, and they want to get picky about the trivial things and ignore the weightier matters of the law. And that's just one small case. I'm sure if we were to take a few minutes of silence, all of you that have been in the church for any length of time can think about something trivial that somebody got upset over. And the whole point is if you were to go and examine that person's life who likes to get upset over stupid things in the church, I guarantee you, if you were to go examine that person's life, you're going to find things in his life that he or she is doing that is not trivial. There's another passage when Jesus says that be careful how you judge, because with it'll be judged back to you. In other words, if you're going to be somebody who likes to make a lot of tiny little judgments over things that don't really matter, people are going to apply that same type of judgment to you, and they're not going to let you get away with anything small or minor. They might not say it to your face, but I guarantee you, behind your back, they're telling everybody, so and so, they're doing this. They like to judge this, but look at them. Okay. And that's not how it should be. It's not how it should be at all. But that is what that kind of triviality breeds. And so Jesus is saying we need to focus on the weightier matters of the law. And he does this, and he calls out these politicians of that time. And I'll call them Jewish politicians of that time. Wasn't like they were Roman senators, but they were the Jewish, the Israelite equivalent of politicians. All right, let's look at John 18. And we do one bell at 15 after, right? And then the second bell at 20. Okay, well, we're just going to do the final bell here in about 3 minutes. So in John chapter 18, and you can put a finger in this, 36 and 37, I'll just summarize it. Jesus came here to establish a kingdom, and he established a kingdom that kind of shook earthly powers. So when Jesus was before Pilate, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, but for this purpose I did come into this world to bear witness to the truth. So essentially, and so then Pilate then goes on to say, well, then are you a king? And Jesus said, you say that I am. All right. Because the Jews were trying to tell Pilate, hey, you need to be careful. You need to be wary because this man is stating that he's a king and that he has more authority than you. And, you know, his kingdom is better than yours, than Rome's. Well, Jesus didn't say any of those things. And I think Pilate understood that. Jesus was saying, my kingdom isn't of this world. So it was spiritual. And one thing that Romans respected when they would go in and conquer another territory was that nation's religion, until they didn't, but up until this point, they did. But this was a political statement. Jesus was making a political statement right here. Let's look at Psalms 2. And then verse 10. The writer says, now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. He's not referring to just the Israelites. He's talking about the judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with his trembling. Jesus right now is asserting God's supreme rule over all the nations. He's saying this kingdom is not of this world. In other words, my kingdom has authority over everything. And then in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, we won't spend a lot of time on this, or we won't spend any, because we're going to be preaching about that. But Jesus commanded us to be the salt and the light. And I would make the argument that you can't be the salt and light without engaging politically. And Jesus knew that. We will look at the last 2 points next week.